A young white girl hung from the remains of the Rosewood settlement, just beyond its charred edge. A crude sign swung above her, scrawled in rough red paint, Indian Land. It was late summer, 1873, and silence had taken the northern plains, not the kind that brought peace but the kind that followed ruin. The wind moved slowly through the scorched bones of the town, dragging the bitter tang of burnt timber and old blood in its breath. Smoke lingered like ghosts, curling from the wreckage, blackened houses, twisted fences, lifeless crops. Even the sky had dulled, smeared with ash and grief. What had once been the settlement's front gate now served as a grim marker. Where it used to stand as a promise of new life, it now held a different truth. Suspended from its beam was a teenage girl, wrists tied high above her head. Clara May, 19 years old, hung there, pale and limp. Dried blood ran along her jaw and down her throat. Her dress, once soft blue, was torn and darkened by smoke. Bare feet hung motionless beneath her. At first glance, she looked dead, but her chest rose barely. She was still breathing. The words painted beside her said, "All the rest, Indian Land." Not far off, a few warriors lingered, their horses picked at dry patches of grass. One man, large and still painted for war, looked toward the gate and the girl hanging from it. "Let them see this," he said, voice low and final. "Let them learn what theft brings." A younger warrior shifted uneasily. "She's just a girl. She wore their name. She shares in what they took." Another man moved from the edge of the broken square. He was lean, quiet, dressed in soft buckskin. His long dark hair was tied back with a faded strip of red. His name was Tyen. Though Comanche by birth, his eyes held no anger. He looked up at the girl, her head lolling slightly, flies already circling her wounds. "I'll bear what's mine," he murmured. The other men turned, eyes sharp. What are you doing, Comanche?" "She breathes," he said simply. "She hasn't crossed over. She's still one of us, still human." Without waiting for agreement, he slid a knife from his belt, its blade clean and sharp. He stepped onto the beam's brace, the charred wood creaking beneath him. "Cut that rope and you leave the circle," one warned. Tyen didn't look back. He climbed higher, smoke curling around him, sunlight catching in his hair. Clara's eyelids fluttered, then stilled. He reached the beam and, in one fluid motion, sliced the rope. Her body fell, but Tyen caught her. He lowered her slowly, cradling her weight. The wind nudged the sign above them, making it creak once, then settle around them. The warriors muttered. One turned away, another spat at the dirt, but no one stepped forward to stop him. Tyen carried her through the ashes of Rosewood, past broken windows and sunken roofs, past walls scorched to bone and fields reduced to dust. He did not stop until the ruin was behind them, near the woods, beside the old well. His horse stood waiting. He placed Clara gently across the blankets tied to the saddle. She stirred as he mounted behind her, her breath shallow. "Let me go," she whispered. He said nothing. Her eyes opened, cloudy with fear. She saw him, his brown skin, his feathered braid, his silence, and her body jolted with panic. She twisted, slid from the horse, and collapsed in the dirt. With a cry, she began crawling toward the trees, limbs shaking, dragging herself over splinters and stone. Tyen dismounted, walked slowly toward her. "No," she gasped, her arms buckled. "Don't." She grabbed a nearby rock, swung it at him with all she had, but it missed, falling harmlessly to the side. Then her voice cracked wide open. "Just kill me," she sobbed. "You savages already took everything." Tears ran over the grime on her cheeks. Her body shook violently once, then went still. The stone slipped from her hand. Her forehead dropped to the earth. Tyen knelt beside her. He brushed the dust from her skin with quiet hands. There was no hatred in his touch, no pity either, only a recognition of something fragile and deeply human. He lifted her once more, arms steady. His voice was barely above a whisper. "You're still here." Asterisk, he murmured something too soft to catch, then lifted her in his arms and disappeared into the trees. The creek whispered as it meandered through the thick pine woods, its waters catching glimmers of dull light filtering through the heavy clouds. Tucked beneath a ridge and half consumed by tangled brush stood a weathered old cabin. its timbers silvered by years of sun, its roof patched with strips of bark and dried mud. Forgotten, left to the forest, that's where Tayan brought her. Clara barely stirred during the ride, her head lolled against the saddle blanket, lips cracked from heat and thirst. Tayan remained silent. When they arrived, he carefully lifted her from the horse and carried her inside. The air was thick with dampness and the scent of old wood and moss. Dust rose around them as he set her down on a mat made of woven grass. He kindled a fire, then soaked a cloth with water from his canteen and pressed it gently to her burning forehead. She regained consciousness at twilight. Her eyes flew open and she screamed, "Don't come near me." The words were feeble, but laced with terror. She scrambled away, teeth clenched in pain as her ribs protested every movement. Tayan didn't respond. He placed the cloth nearby and quietly stepped outside, sitting by the fire to give her space. Neither of them slept that night. When dawn broke, Clara made a desperate attempt to leave. She stumbled down the slope, reached the edge of the trees, then collapsed when her ankle gave out. Her face landed in a bed of pine needles, her dress torn on thorny branches, arms too weak to lift. Tayan found her there. He didn't speak or touch her. He simply waited. When her pain grew too sharp to endure, she turned toward him, and only then did he gather her in his arms and carry her back. Silent and slow, that no harsh words followed, no anger. When she tried again that evening and collapsed beside the creek, he found her unconscious and brought her back once more. After the third time, she stopped trying to escape. When she awoke again, wrapped in the same blanket, rage surged in her chest. She threw it off. "Why won't you just kill me like the rest of them?" she spat. Tayan sat cross-legged nearby, his hands open on his knees. "I didn't destroy your home," he said quietly, "but I saw who did." Her breath caught in her throat. "My people," he continued. "Comanche, Kiowa, Cheyenne, yes, they were there. I won't pretend otherwise." Her lips quivered. "If your home was taken," he added, "then let me give you one in return." She recoiled, unsure whether to take his words as mercy or manipulation. He stood and walked out without saying more. A while later, the smell of something warm drifted into the shelter, not wood smoke, but food. He returned with a clay bowl, steam curling upward in the cool air. Clara sat upright now, her back resting against the wall, wrists swollen, fingers stiff. She eyed him warily. He crouched beside her and offered the bowl. When she didn't reach for it, he noticed her hand couldn't hold it. Without a word, he dipped the spoon, cooled it with his breath, and brought it gently to her lips. She parted them slightly. The first swallow was rough. The second went smoother. She coughed, then let him feed her more. She watched him closely. No anger lived in his face, no condemnation, only steadiness, only calm. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice hushed. "Tayan," he replied. She nodded, barely. Her fingers curled into the blanket's edge. Outside, the wind whispered through the pine branches. Inside, for the first time in what felt like forever, she let her eyes fall shut, not from exhaustion, but from something quieter. Not quite safety, but something close. Time drifted by beneath that secluded ridge, not marked by clocks or calendars, but by shifting light and the way it moved through the cracked cabin walls. Clara's body healed slowly. Bruises faded to pale smudges, wounds knit into delicate scars. But trust came far more slowly, if at all. She still startled at sharp sounds, still tensed when Tayan moved too quickly. But she no longer tried to flee. Instead, she watched. He rarely spoke. His footsteps were soft. He never slammed the door or raised his voice. When he did speak, it was simple, measured English. He'd say in the morning, placing warm bread wrapped in cloth nearby, water. He'd tell her when he returned from the stream, hair dripping, shirt clinging to his back. And once, when distant thunder rolled across the hills and made her curl up like a frightened child, he knelt beside her, placed his hand to the earth, and said, "Safe, not war." She looked at him with doubt, but a part of her, buried deep, wanted to believe. Tayan never pushed, never hovered. Each morning, he left small offerings near the door, strips of dried meat, berries, a chunk of cornbread. She never saw him place them, but they were always there, waiting. Quiet gestures, like a promise he didn't try to explain. And slowly, the tight knot of fear inside her began to ease. It didn't vanish, but it softened. It didn't become trust, but it became something close. They offered each other truths without speaking. He slept near the hearth. She stayed close to the far wall. The space between them wasn't made of distance, it was a quiet, mutual decision. One morning, wrapped in mist and the lingering smell of ash, Clara stepped outside. The forest held its breath. She spotted him hunched over on a flat stone, carving something from a piece of wood no bigger than a loaf of bread. His knife didn't slice, it coaxed. She stood still, watching from afar, arms crossed against the chill, saying nothing. Later that day, once he had gone to fetch water, Clara returned to that same stone. She bent over what he had been working on, a bird or something close to one. Its wings were half open, its beak tilted toward the sky. It was rough, unfinished, but it pulsed with a strange kind of energy, as if it were in the middle of being born. She touched its wing gently, ran her thumb across a jagged edge. That night, when he returned and found her by the fire, the carving rested in her lap. She didn't try to hide it. She met his gaze and said, barely above a whisper, "If you carve me wings, I'll try to fly." He didn't reply, but something behind his eyes shifted, slight, but unmistakable. The next morning, she followed him into the woods to gather firewood. She moved stiffly, her ankles still weak, her arms not yet strong, but she carried a small bundle back without falling. He noticed, said nothing. That evening, she stirred the stew while he sliced roots in silence, the kind of quiet that usually slips by unnoticed, until she spilled too much salt and muttered under her breath. He looked up with a raised brow and said, dryly, "Bad magic." She blinked, then let out a small, startled laugh. It was brief, but real. He tilted his head, the corners of his mouth tugging upward, not quite a smile, but close. They ate side by side, firelight washing their faces. They didn't touch, but sat close enough that the warmth reached across the space between them. The stew smelled of slow-cooked bones and wild onions. They didn't speak much, but in the silence, something passed between them, an understanding without words. When she burned her tongue, he handed her a cool drink with a grunt that carried amusement. And when he forgot to stir the pot and it blackened at the bottom, she sniffed and said, "Tastes like revenge." He chuckled, the sound rough, like it had been buried for a long time. Later, as they cleaned their bowls, she glanced at him and asked, "Why do you live here, alone?" He paused. "Too many graves," he said finally, then added, quieter, "None of them mine." She didn't ask more. That was enough. That night, as she lay on her bed of woven reeds and patched hides, she stared across the room at the bird resting on the wooden shelf. Its wings were still half-formed, but something in its posture moved her, not sadness, but a strange, quiet stirring. She didn't love him, not yet, and he hadn't asked for that. But for the first time since the world had burned down, she felt a little less like a ghost, more like a person. A girl who had shared a meal with someone who no longer felt like a stranger. Something kindled between them, not a fire to destroy, but a flame meant to warm. Winter arrived early that week. Slipping down from the hills, the wind leaned against the walls of their shelter like a warning, and the fire inside crackled low, thick with pine smoke and stew. Clara sat close to the flames, knees tucked beneath the blanket he had repaired the day before. Her fingers traced the new stitching, not because she was cold, but because she needed something steady. Next to her, time carved again. His blade whispered through the wood. The bird had changed, more feathers now, wings open wider, ready for flight. She watched him working. Silence for a long time. Then she spoke, her voice dry, quiet. "They killed my parents," she said, eyes fixed on the fire. "Not in a fight, just came in, shot my father in the back while he cooked, took my mother outside, cut her throat." Tyne said nothing. He didn't move. "My sister tried to run," Clara said. "She was 14. They caught her, took her." She swallowed. "I don't know if she's still alive." The fire cracked sharply, but the silence didn't break. "I hid in the root cellar," she went on. "Watched them burn the Thompsons through a gap in the floorboards. Mr. Thompson tried to shield his baby. Didn't matter. They all died. She looked over at Tyne. Her eyes were dry, but something fierce flickered behind them. They painted. The doors in blood. I'll never forget the smell. Tyne lowered his carving. When he finally spoke, his voice was slow, deep like something heavy shifting beneath the earth. I wasn't there, he said, but my people were. She went still, body tense but didn't back away. I was taken when I was 5, he said, by the Comanche. I don't remember my real parents, just fire, screams, then nothing. He leaned back and looked at the ceiling. There was a woman in the tribe. She had no sons. She kept me, raised me, but you didn't belong, Clara said quietly. He shook his head. To white, hair to pale, eyes like a coyote, they said. I learned their ways, learned to ride, hunt, fight, but I was always an outsider. She watched him. Why'd they keep you? He gave a dry, almost bitter smile. Because I survived. That made me worth something. A long silence. She asked, why did you help me? He looked at her, met her gaze without looking away. His answer came softly, but with certainty. Because if someone had helped me, he said, maybe I wouldn't be so good at being alone. The words lingered in the air like embers quiet glowing. They didn't burn, but they stayed. The gift wasn't meant to impress or convince, it was a gesture of sincerity. Clara stared at her hands, still gripping the hide blanket. Her chest tightened not with fear or fury, but something sharper, stranger, recognition. They hadn't walked the same roads, hadn't been born of the same people, yet sorrow had left its mark on both, carved in similar patterns. She rose quietly and went to the scattered pile of small items Tayan had been gathering over the past week's scraps of leather and fabric, broken clasps, bits of sinew. Kneeling, she picked up a piece of soft hide and carried it back to the fire. Tayan said nothing as he watched her thread a needle with shaky hands. Still healing from her sprained wrist, her stitches were rough, clumsy, but she never looked away. Slowly, the material began to resemble a simple handkerchief frayed at the edges, but intact. Once she finished the border, she glanced up at him. I've never sewn before, she murmured. My mother tried to teach me, but I always fumbled. Tayan shrugged lightly. Looks whole to me. A small smile touched her lips, the first in a while. Then she bent over the cloth again and stitched a final word into one corner awkward. Uneven letters. She extended it toward him. He didn't take it right away, just looked at it like it carried more than he was ready to feel. Maybe pride, maybe guilt. It's not much, Clara said, but it's the first thing I've ever made that wasn't just to stay alive. Eventually, he reached out and took it gently, folding it with care, as though it might fall apart, if handled too roughly. Then, for the first time since the night he'd cut her down, he said her name aloud, Clara. She met his gaze not as someone rescued, not as a stranger, but as someone who understood him, wounded in similar ways. Just from the other side of the same fire, that morning was still, wrapped in the hush of something inevitable. Mist clung to the trees, muting the forest sounds. Tayan had left early to check traps near the ravine. Clara sat by the hearth, humming softly as she ground acorns. For a rare moment, it felt like the world had stepped away from war. But then came the hoof beats, distant at first, like a pulse in the ground. Tayan sensed them before she did. He froze, body coiled tight, eyes narrowing toward the east. Clara stepped outside, a basket on her arm, and saw him standing motionless, eyes locked on the fog. What is it? She asked. He didn't respond. Figures emerged, 6 Comanche warriors, bare-chested, their skin painted, bone ornaments hanging from their necks, fringe swaying as they walked. The one in front stepped closer, gaze fixed on Tayan. You are remembered, he said in Comanche, but not forgiven. Tayan stood firm. I walked away from the war. You've brought it back to me. The man's eyes moved to Clara. You hide what was meant to burn. She was marked. You sheltered her. She wasn't fire, Tayan replied. She was what was left of it. Another stepped forward, voice sharp. She is the mark. If she lives, our enemies think we failed. The line must not break. Tayan moved to stand between them and Clara. She's under my protection. One reached out and grabbed his shoulder. Tayan shoved him back, and then it began. They struck him, fists, elbows. the blunt end of a spear slamming into his ribs. Clara screamed as he dropped, blood trailing down his face, even on his knees. He tried to shield her. "She's mine." "To guard," he shouted. "You don't get to finish what you started." But there were too many. They overpowered him and dragged him away, heels dragging through the soil. "Clara, go," he yelled. She ran not blindly, but with purpose down the trail, to the ravine, squeezing into the mossy cave they'd used before. She pressed herself into the shadows, hands over her mouth, shaking. Outside, the chaos faded. Hoofbeats vanished into the distance. A long, cold silence followed. She waited long, enough for her knees to go numb and her lungs to ache from holding her breath. Then she emerged. "Tayan," she called softly. He was slumped near the fire. Blood dried along his face, chest barely rising. She dropped to her knees beside him, hands trembling as she brushed hair from his brow. His eyes fluttered open. "You stayed," he whispered. And then he went still. The days that followed blurred, filled with fear, sweat, and frantic hope. His fever rose. He muttered in his sleep, called her name, and others she didn't recognize. She did what she could: cool cloths, bitter teas, ground herbs, but nothing worked. On the 5th day, eyes hollow and limbs aching, she gathered her things, strapped a blade to her waist, and left. She crawled through thickets, searched riverbanks, scraped bark with raw fingers. A snake hissed near her, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. That night, she returned, arms full of gathered plants and stubborn determination. She brewed the herbs, fed him with a spoon, and sang quietly to him. "Don't go," she whispered, gripping his hand. "Please stay." At dawn, his fever broke. His eyes opened, bloodshot and tired, but clear. "You came back," he croaked. "I never left," she whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. When he closed his eyes again, it wasn't from weakness. It was rest, peace. Later, he woke to the scent of burning herbs, medicinal, not threatening. The fire crackled gently beside him, casting warm shadows on the walls. His whole body hurt, but it was the ache of endurance, not defeat. He was still alive. The ache in his head lingered, echoing faintly with each breath, but the fever had passed. The fire snapped and hissed, steady and real. He was still alive. Clara sat close to the hearth, legs folded beneath her, wrapped tightly in a worn blanket. Her hair hung in loose tangles, her face marked with ash and weariness. Yet her eyes remained fixed on the flames, fighting off sleep. Her chin dipped once, then again, until the faintest rustle stirred her. She looked up quickly, alert. Their eyes met. He didn't speak. His throat was raw, lips dry and cracked, but his expression asked a quiet, almost disbelieving question. Clara leaned forward, filled a tin cup with water, and held it to his lips. He drank in slow sips, wincing at the bitter herbal taste. She set the cup down and pressed a cool cloth to his forehead, wiping away the last of the fevered sweat. "You didn't leave," he said hoarsely. She didn't answer with words, didn't smile, just gave a small nod. He let his eyes fall shut again, feeling the fire's warmth sink into his skin, and listening to her steady breathing beside him. "I thought I was alone," he murmured. "I know," she replied gently, moving a little closer. "You kept saying my name, even when you couldn't catch your breath." His eyes fluttered open again. The fire's light cast shifting shadows across her face. She looked older somehow, not in years, but in spirit, like someone who had stood through storms and not broken. "I heard you," she said softly, "even when I was hiding, even when I was too afraid to come." He didn't ask why she returned. He didn't need to. Days pass. Slowly, he healed in fragments, bit by bit, his strength returning. Clara was always nearby. She brought him thin soup, changed the dressings on his wounds, helped him sit up when the pain became too much. Not once did she speak of leaving again. Each morning, when sunlight pushed through the trees and painted the clearing in soft gold, Clara would find something resting near the door. First, a pale feather bound with thin leather. Then, a tiny pot holding a green sprout nestled in moss. Later, a smooth stone with two birds carved into it, one soaring, one at rest. And finally, a bird shaped from wood, wings stretched wide, eyes open to the sky. It stood alone on a flat rock in the early light. She picked it up carefully, tracing its shape with her fingertips, feeling the time and quiet patience that had gone into each curve and line. Inside, Tyen sat upright for the first time, wrapped in a blanket, his back against the wall. Their eyes met once more this time, with nothing left unspoken between them. She placed the carved bird on the mantel, then took her place beside him, their shoulders touching. No words passed. None were needed. Her return hadn't been from guilt. She hadn't come back because she owed him anything. She had simply chosen to people. Once shattered, now choosing to begin again together. The home they made wasn't beautiful by any grand measure. There were no polished windows, no colorful shutters, and the wooden floor creaked beneath their feet, but it stood firm, high on the ridge above the stream. It was built from thick logs and hardened earth, its roof patched with bark and hides. To keep the weather out, the old shelter was taken apart slowly, each board saved and reused. They built the new house with their own hands. Every timber held their effort. Every stone in the fireplace was laid with care. Clara dug a root cellar. Her hands blistered, her face streaked with sweat, but proud. Tyen carved patterns into the doorway, not symbols from old tales, but small markings that meant something only to them. When it was done, when it felt like more than a structure, more than just walls, Clara took a piece of pine and carved words into it, carefully and without haste. Home of Clara and Tyen, where no one is left hanging. She nailed the sign above the door herself, that it was late summer when they found the boy. They were deep in the woods, searching for wild honey, when they heard soft crying. Beneath an overturned wagon, buried in leaves and dust, lay a small child no older than 5. His clothing was torn, his temple bruised, his eyes too wide, too haunted. For 3 days, he said nothing. They brought him back with them, gave him warm broth and a place to rest near the fire. Tyen kept his distance. Clara offered simple words: blanket, fire, safe. On the 4th morning, he reached for Clara's hand and whispered, "Anina." Her breath hitched, her eyes welled. It was Comanche, a word for mother. Later that same week, as Tyen crouched beside him, fixing the wheel of a small wooden cart, the boy said softly, "Pana." Tyen paused, then smiled. Father. They never pressed him about the past, never asked what happened or who had been lost. It was enough that he stayed, that he smiled, that he slowly learned letters as Clara drew them with charcoal on bark, that he ate with them, sometimes laughing, sometimes waking with names on his lips neither of them knew. That year, they planted uneven rows of corn, built a coop for chickens, hummed melodies without words. When the evenings were warm, they sat outside under the stars, the boy nestled between them, pointing upward. Tyen would give each constellation a name from the stories of his people. In time, others began to arrive, travelers without a place to go, traders passing through, wanderers carrying old maps and worn shoes. Some stayed for a night, some offered seeds, shared advice, or told stories from places far away. Everyone was given a meal. Everyone was safe. Their home on the ridge became more than shelter. It became a promise. They imagined a haven untouched by cruelty, a place where no one was pursued, abandoned, or condemned for the color of their skin or the ancestry in their blood. And every morning, as sunlight spilled across the treetops, a weathered wooden sign above the doorway caught the glow like a quiet blessing. Home of Clara and Tyen, where no one was left behind. Time passed like a slow-moving stream, shaping the days as gently as water smooths stone. The years left their marks, laugh lines, silver hair, softer steps. The little house atop the ridge stood its ground. The roof aged. The garden grew wild, more mint and thistle than crops now, but the birds kept returning, nesting in the rafters. Smoke curled from the chimney each morning, and though the letters on the sign faded, the words never disappeared. Home of Clara and Tyen, where no one was left behind. Then one crisp autumn morning, long after the child they raised had grown and started his own family, visitors arrived. Men from the government, their boots polished, their shirts stiff, their tones smooth and rehearsed like lawyers in a courtroom. They carried maps, confident words, and official offers. The railroad would soon pass through this land. The nation had plans. There would be compensation. They said, but either way, the tracks were coming. Clara met them in the doorway, flowers still on her fingers and the smell of rising bread in the air. She stood tall, her gaze weathered but unshaken. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she turned slightly, motioning toward the house behind her. That roof was patched after a war, she said calmly. These walls were raised by hands that once bled. The men looked at each other, unsure. This isn't just land. It was built with sorrow and with grace. We won't give that up. Tyne stepped beside her then, quiet as ever. He said nothing, just stood close, his presence steady even with age tugging at his spine. He looked to the trees, the worn path their grandson had once run barefoot, the unruly garden that refused to be tamed. Then he looked at Clara and gave a single, deliberate nod. The officials didn't stay much longer. A week later, someone hammered a new sign into a post near the stony trail, just beyond the last bloom of wildflowers. It read, not Indian land, not white land, just loved land. And beneath that, written in Clara's steady hand, we already found what we were looking for. In the years that followed, their home became more than shelter. It became a refuge. The forgotten came, the broken, a girl with nowhere to run, a boy with scars, a mother grieving too many losses. They brought only their sorrow and were met with open arms. They were fed, offered rest, taught to fish, to mend clothes, to trace constellations. Some stayed, others healed and moved on, but none forgot the warmth of the firelight or the couple who asked nothing of their pasts. Clara still dried herbs near the hearth. Tyne still carved tiny birds, though his fingers now shook. Their son visited often, his children in tow children, who called them Enna and Panna. On golden afternoons, they'd gather beneath the old oak tree to trade stories, some true, some softened by time, and each night, as the house settled into its familiar quiet, Clara would curl beside Tyne, their bodies fit together like pieces worn by time. Her hand would rest gently on his shoulder, fingertips brushing over old wounds, and she would whisper, "You didn't just give me shelter, you gave me a life." His reply rarely came in words, just a low sound in his chest, a hum that meant yes, that meant he understood, that meant thank you. They never left the ridge, and when their time was done, the house remained. Travelers still stumbled upon the path. They still read the sign, not Indian land, not white land, just loved land. And some cried because, in a world still split by borders and bitterness, someone had once built something different, a home not on power or pride, but on kindness, on memory, on love. If this story settled somewhere quiet in your chest, if Clara's unshakable calm and Tyne's steady silence felt like a vow, then you've felt what lies at the center of stories like these. Tales from forgotten trails and untamed places, not just about love, but about healing, about honor in the absence of justice, about tenderness after a long stretch of pain. This kind of love doesn't wait to be allowed. It simply remains. If you believe broken ground can bloom again, if you believe in love that refuses to be buried beneath history, hurt, or division, don't just listen. Become part of it. Subscribe to Wild West Love Stories. Share this with someone who still believes in hope, because out here, in the quiet winds and wide spaces, love was never simple, but it was always true.